Today we're talking about box press cigars. Now, if you think box pressing is just a round cigar that somebody squeezed into a square, most everything about that concept is wrong. Most cigars sold as box pressed are not even truly box pressed. The cigar has to be built differently to be truly box pressed before pressing ever even starts. Humidity can completely change the final shape. And there are actually two very different ways that manufacturers like us create what you see on the shelf. By the end of this video, I'm going to show you the difference, and I'll give you my theory about how box pressing may have started in the first place. Box pressing has become incredibly popular, especially in the New World cigar market, and we love it ourselves. But where the process originally came from is surprisingly difficult to pin down. I don't know that anyone really has a definitive answer as to where box pressing came from, and I'm not going to pretend that we do. And my theory is based on something that still happens in cigar factories just like this to this day. But I want to come back to that at the end of the video. First, we need to understand what a box press actually is, because this is where the myth really starts. One of the most common explanations I hear is that box press cigars simply have less tobacco in them. And that's kind of true, kind of, sort of, not really. But it's kind of wrong at the same time. You've probably heard this many times over, that there's one fewer leaf or something in a box press cigar. Now, if you took a cigar that was bunched exactly like a normal round cigar and aggressively pressed it into a square shape, there's a good chance you would make that cigar simply draw too tight. So box pressing actually begins with the bunchero. There are two primary bunching methods that I would focus on, something called Semi-cuadro and cuadro. In this factory, we use something called Semi-cuadro. With Semi-cuadro, it reduces some of the center fill inside of the bunch. Typically, that means reducing some of the tells, or the sometimes called frog legs, that we kind of rip off of the bottom of the bunch and center fill in. Those tend to be discarded or accumulate a little bit less in a Semi-cuadro. And we don't draw them as regularly through the center in a Semi-cuadro. We just simply make the cigar a lot looser by not center filling the bunch. You can make a stylistic adjustment around how exactly you do this, but the concept is simple. You're creating enough room inside of the bunching for the cigar to be compressed later without destroying the draw. And if you want to check out our draw check video on the Drawmaster 40, we have that as well. I'll put a link to it below. You're not trying to make an empty cigar. You're trying to preserve the blend while preparing it for compression. And that's what Semi-cuadro does best. Now, the other method is called cuadro. Now, cuadro, or chart, I don't know where they come up with these names, is a much looser way of building the bunch. And we do not use that in this factory. With cuadro, the cigar can be incredibly soft through the center all the way to the foot. And even after reaching the press, depending on the blend, you also will be using considerably less tobacco to actually manufacture that cigar. So this is where the statement that box press cigars contain less tobacco actually comes from. With Semi-cuadro, you're primarily reducing the center fill or discarding those legs. With cuadro, you can physically reduce the total amount of tobacco, but you're generally doing that equally across the blend. So not necessarily one less leaf, but tremendously less tobacco overall. And from our perspective, once you remove enough tobacco, you begin changing the character of the blend. The airflow changes, the density changes, and the relationship between those tobaccos frankly changes, and they draw test quite a bit looser whenever they are bunched cuadro in a box press. So those are the two very different ways of preparing a cigar that might eventually look fairly similar from the outside. The next concept is figuring. And no, I don't mean how you dress. But when we talk about figuring, we are talking about how sharply defined the finished box press is, or what the corners actually look like in the press. Imagine an informal scale where you have 0 to 5. 0 being extremely soft around the edges and very rounded edges. And then 5 is like a razor sharp, 90-degree edge where the corners are very hard and form these really rigid press lines. That's a highly figured box press. And one of the biggest controls over that finished shape is humidity. Box pressing is probably one of the most humidity sensitive operations that we perform in a cigar factory. And remember, the wrapper already has to be on the cigar. We're pressing a finished cigar. There's a lot of confusion as to whether the cigar becomes box pressed before the wrapper. If you begin pressing immediately after rolling, the wrapper, binder, and filler are still carrying a tremendous amount of moisture. That tobacco is much more pliable under pressure. It conforms aggressively towards the press, creating a higher figured corner on the box press. That's what creates those very sharp press lines. This works especially easily for loose cuadro bunches. For the softer semi-cuadro press that we prefer, we do almost the opposite of that operation. We actually wait. And we are waiting for those cigars generally to rest for about 12 to 24 hours before we begin pressing. We want them much closer to that smoking humidity, around a relative humidity or mass content of 11%, relative humidity of say 60, 65. That cigar is less willing to collapse into the hard corners, allowing us to create a defined box press while maintaining a softer rounded edge. For our cigars, I would call that roughly a number 2 figure. Again, there's really no standard as to how you figure the edges or a ruler that you use in this case. Now, to get to something that most cigar smokers do not realize, a lot of what you're smoking and calling box press is actually trunk press. And trunk pressing is not at all the same as a true box press. With trunk press, the cigars are actually laid together and you have pressure above and below them, but no individual supports between the individual cigars. The sides of each cigar are being formed by the cigars next to them. So imagine one cigar has a harder section and then beside it has a softer section. One cigar ends up influencing the other cigar, and that can continue shifting the cigar press all the way down, well, down the trunk, because it is in fact a trunk. There are incredibly successful cigar makers that are using trunk pressing today. You see it especially with factories that are kind of Cuban manufacturing heritage. For some reason, this seems to be the go-to way. It works, but from a consistency standpoint on the cigars, you have less control over each individual cigar, and the forming of the cigar is really up to the cigar next to it. There's another major advantage though, is that it's much cheaper. You don't damage as much wrapper because it's wrapper against wrapper, and they're at pretty similar humidity at this point. True box pressing requires substantially more equipment. Instead of allowing one cigar to press against the next, we place wooden shims between every single cigar. That means each cigar has support on its side, so it's box pressed on its side. Its shape is being controlled by how tight you figure the press, rather than its neighboring cigar. That gives much more repeatability, but all of the extra wood introduces another pretty interesting variable here, and that it's now drying. Think about how much wood surface area is now touching the wrapper. That wood is pulling humidity away from the wrapper and the binder while the cigar is being held under pressure. So a true box press is not simply changing the shape, it's changing the drying environment of the cigar during that pressing period. And that becomes part of how the blend settles after rolling. You have different tobaccos coming together with different moisture levels in the blend, different pH, different enzymic activity. Once you change water, time, pressure, drying, you are changing the environment in which the cigar stabilizes. So I do not personally consider box pressing a purely cosmetic effect. So take a good look at what's happening here. With every cigar with wood on either side, we're controlling each cigar individually rather than allowing one cigar to form the one next to it. Then we have a control time. For the soft number 2 figuring that we generally want, the cigars rest first for roughly 12 to 24 hours after rolling. Then they enter the press in this form. First pressing cycle lasts about 24 hours. After that, we rotate the cigars, press them approximately another 24 hours. That rotation greatly helps with the forming of the cigar to make sure that it hasn't balanced to one side or the other, changing the figuring. So in total, we have more than 48 hours of actual press time invested in creating what looks like a fairly simple, softly squared cigar. The rotation helps maintain those round edges as well. As the cigar is drying, the binder starts to fix in place and locks in that shape. By changing the cigar's orientation during the process, we can create a soft, even box press instead of one aggressively crushing the edge, which is not really my preference. If we want sharper, more heavily figured corners, you can press wetter and allow the tobacco to conform much more aggressively to the press, and still actually utilize a Semi-cuadro as well. Trunk pressing can go in the other direction entirely. I've seen trunk press processes where the cigars remain under pressure for weeks, sometimes even longer, essentially drying and aging while still being pressed. And that is simply a completely different manufacturing philosophy. Now we can answer one old question correctly. Do box press cigars contain less tobacco? Well, the short answer, inconveniently, is maybe. A Semi-cuadro cigar primarily is reducing center fill so the bunch can withstand compression while preserving the blend as much as possible. A cuadro cigar, which you could probably barely see on these videos we shot, physically contains less tobacco because the entire bunch is intentionally built much looser from the beginning, but it's not necessarily a different blend. Those cigars may look similar after pressing, but internally they are not necessarily the same thing. And once you know what you're looking for between the two of these, you can start to actually feel some of the differences. You can look at the corners of the cigars that have been pressed and rolled in a cuadro, and you can look at the head and you can look at how consistent the forming is from the head to the foot. A soft Semi-cuadro cigar can feel dramatically different from a loose cuadro cigar that has been heavily figured or trunk pressed. Now we can finally come back to the question at the beginning of the video, which was, where did box pressing originate? Now, I can't give you a definitive historical answer. So what I'm about to give you is strictly a theory that I've come up with. And my theory comes from something that we still do inside this factory today. Once wrapper has been applied to a cigar, your options become limited if something goes wrong. And that could be a shoulder failure, a soft spot that wasn't noticed before. Maybe something in the shoulder came out a little too soft for comfort, and maybe the cigar is slightly underfilled. Maybe it didn't make an expected weight when weighing the cigars. At any point, whenever you've rejected the cigar, removing the wrapper and rebuilding the cigar may not make sense at all. But you can actually press that cigar. We actually box press rejected cigars in our factory to make them available to our employees. And I imagine there are quite a few other factories that are doing the same thing. The employees absolutely love them. One reason is that the pressing helps those cigars become smokable much faster. If you think about it, you have wood against the cigars, you have pressure, you're pulling moisture out. So after a 48-hour cycle, that cigar can be substantially closer to something an employee can actually light up and enjoy. And that really got me wondering whether box pressing could have started from something incredibly practical. So just imagine a roller with a felled cigar generations ago who finishes his day, and that cigar may be too wet to actually smoke right away. Maybe it's slightly underfilled, maybe it was rejected, maybe he simply wanted to smoke it sooner. Now, if you simply put that cigar under a board or a book or something heavy around the rolling table, Suddenly, you have a crude press that also helps dry the cigar much faster. And there's also another possibility: packaging. Now, imagine cigars packed tightly into a wooden box while being relatively dry and then shipped under pressure, later exposed to changing humidity in that box. The cigars begin taking on the shape of the box as they simply start rehydrating. That starts to accidentally look a lot like a very soft box pressed cigar. Could either one of those scenarios be where the modern box press came from? Well, maybe. Ultimately, I can't prove it. But I find both of those theories to be believable because versions of those exact things still happen today naturally in cigar manufacturing. Both pressing cigars to salvage them and cigars that are packed very tightly into a box. What I can tell you is that box pressing is much more complicated than taking a round cigar and making it square. The bunch has to be prepared for compression. Humidity controls how aggressively that shape is going to develop. The amount of figuring that is chosen and press time changes the actual result of the box press. Rotation changes the edge, and the trunk press is not the same process as a true box press. So the next time you pick up a box press, take a closer look at it. Look at the corners, feel the density, look at how consistent the overall shape of the box press is. One shape from end to end can be dramatically different in a trunk press. And ask yourself, am I holding a true box press or am I holding a trunk press cigar? And now I want to know, what do you actually prefer? Do you prefer a softly figured box press? Do you like those extremely sharp 90-degree edges that, cut the corner of your lips when you put it in your mouth? Some people are really into that, I guess. And before watching this video, did you know there was a difference between trunk pressing and true box pressing? If you enjoy getting this far into the minutia of how cigars are actually manufactured, give us a like, subscribe, and tell me what part of cigar manufacturing you'd like us to break down next. Until next time, take care.